our second session for the day on the topic Mastering Liquification and Enzymolysis. So I would like to request our speaker for today. Before that, I would like to introduce him, Mr. Chris Richards. Hold a degree in Brewing and Biological Sciences from Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. Can we please have a huge round of applause for him? A very warm welcome to you. He has over 4 decades of experience in the brewing, distilling, and biofuels industry, including roles in production sales and management. He is also a distinguished speaker internationally and has authored scientific articles as well as 2 chapters in the 6th edition of the alcohol textbook. At Lallemand Biofules and Distilled Spirits, USA, he oversees international sales and business development of fermentation ingredients for biofuels and distilled spirits industry. A very warm welcome to you, sir. I would also like to invite on stage Mr. Richards Associates. Can we please have on stage Mr. Rajesh Mohan along with Mr. Deepak Jhunjhunwala? And can we have a round of applause for all the speakers for our second session? Once again, a gentle reminder to our speakers, we will have a session for 30 minutes. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. That's a good introduction. I would say that my 4 decades of experience just means I'm old. So I spent a long time in industry. I've seen a lot of things, covered to many countries, and I actually enjoy coming to India to see the enthusiasm, the excitement, and the growth of the industry that's coming. I see a lot of future here. So Lallemand, our story is we were founded in Montreal at the end of the 19th century, but we started yeast production in our factory in 1923. So we actually celebrated 100 years of making yeast in that factory, and it's still in production today. But we've grown. We now have over 4,500 employees. We're in 6 out of the 7 continents. When they start doing something in Antarctica, we'll go there as well. We have 48 plants for yeast, enzymes, and bacteria. And it's a family-owned business, and it's owned by the Chagnon family since 1952. What do? We do pretty much anything and everything to do with yeast and bacteria. I'm not going to go through all of these, except I will mention a couple of interesting ones. The plant care one, we're actually using microorganisms to replace herbicides and pesticides. So we're taking chemicals out of the system. We're also using nitrogen-fixing bacteria to get rid of some of the fertilizers as well. So what are we going to talk about today? Enzymes fundamentals. I'm sure I'm probably teaching a lot of you things that you already know, but I think it's important that people understand how these enzymes work, how they're produced, and how they can impact your process. So enzymes are a special class of proteins, and they're made up of amino acids, and they are bound by various bonds into a very, very specific shape. And this becomes very important. The amino acids are folded into this molecule, and that shape binds itself to a very, very specific substrate. So enzymes effectively are catalysts that enable chemical reactions to happen a lot quicker, but without the same amount of energy that you would normally need to do that on a wet chemistry. So that shape becomes extremely critical, so that it becomes, the classic example is the lock and key. So you have a key, you put it in a lock, it becomes unlocked. You have an enzyme and a substrate, and it matches up to that shape, and it will then cause that shape to either break up into an altered substrate or the product that you're looking for. However, if the substrate is different or the enzyme is different, you get a key that doesn't fit. So it won't unlock. So there's no reaction that will occur. So where are enzymes found? Enzymes are found in every single living thing. It's how your body controls its food. It's how your body controls the breakdown. It's how your body makes up its new proteins. There are tens of thousands of enzymes in your body. Amylase breaks down sugar in your mouth. If you actually start to chew corn or popcorn, it will melt in your mouth. And that's the amylase breaking down the gelatinized popcorn, the corn that's been popped. Yeast, bacteria, microorganisms produce most of the industrial enzymes. If we're going to produce an enzyme, it's made by a bacteria typically, and then that bacteria is removed, and what you receive in your plants is the supernatant fluid that contains the enzymes that the bacteria have released. So let's talk about ethanol production. So what is it that the enzymes are doing? They're critical to maximize your ethanol yield. The things you have to understand that there are differences between the US industry, European industry, and the Indian industry. And in my opinion, probably the biggest difference and the biggest weakness of this industry is in analyzing the data in your plant throughout the process. Nearly every plant here uses the wet chemistry, creating RS and RST. That doesn't happen in the US. In the US, they use the HPLC and they will look at the individual sugars, the glucose, the maltose, the maltotriose, then the DP4s or the dextrins. And that allows you to understand your fermentations, your breakdown, and control it and make adaptations to your process. I've said this for the last 10 or 15 years in India that I've been visiting. When you're running at 8 to 12% alcohol, it's like walking on a pavement. You're not likely to fall over. You might stub your toe a little bit, but you won't do much damage. When you go to the 12 to 14, 15, maybe 16% by volume, it's like walking on a plank, 6 foot up in the air. If you trip or misstep, you're going to hurt yourself. But when you go to the 16 to 18 to 20%, as they are achieving in the US, when you fall, it hurts. And for instance, if you have a contamination in a US plant that's aiming for 20% alcohol, you're likely to lose 3 or 4% alcohol production in that fermenter. If you do the same contamination at 10 or 12%, you're liable to lose maybe 0.1, 0.2. That's the difference. It's a risk reward. So why is that important about enzymes? Because you have to present to the yeast the sugars and the sugar complexes at the right time, at the right concentration, allowing with the least stress. So you want to minimize the residual starch. You need to improve the physical process. But on the other side, you're actually producing high-value co-products, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You can generate high-protein streams. Your DDGS can be high-protein streams. And the other thing is that is probably different here. As you are building up your maize utilization in India, nearly every plant in the US, because of an economic disaster that happened a few years ago, all the plants that were the most successful during that economic disaster were ones that were extracting corn oil. And that corn oil was as a separate substrate stream, profit stream, allowed them to survive better. So I would say to you, anyone that is moving to corn more than 50% of the time, you should really look at the economics of corn oil extraction in your plant. So what are we looking at? We're looking at targeting molecules in the corn kernels. I think this is a similar picture to the one that's shown in the first talk. But you have fiber, you have starch molecules, you have proteins. And in this particular one, you can see how it's all bound together and interacted, and you have to try and break that up. And then also in the germ, which is here, which is pretty much where most of the oil comes from. By the way, somebody asked a question about milling or not milling. There is only one plant that I know of in the world that actually does not mill their grain at all. And it's a whiskey plant in the UK, and they actually use pressure and temperature to explode the grain, and they effectively pop the corn open, and they do the gelatinization there. They've looked at the energy on the milling, and it's a very, very fine balance. So that this process, they have half of their process is done on this side, and half is actually using on milling. But it can be done. I personally wouldn't recommend it. It creates a lot of technical difficulties, and it's a harder process to monitor and manage. So during liquefaction, alpha amylase breaks the gelatinized starch into dextrins, short chains. And basically, how many of you have young children and you give them a pair of scissors and their sister's hair is long and it ends up all in chunks on the floor in different sizes, different places? That's effectively what alpha amylase does. It just takes a pair of scissors to the starch molecule and chops it at random points. Then during the fermentation, the glucoamylase converts the dextrins into glucose, which the yeast can convert. Now, when you're talking about yeast, the yeast has a preference for glucose over pretty much any other sugar. It can handle maltose, or two glucose molecules joined together, quite well. It doesn't handle maltotriose very well, and it cannot handle anything bigger than 3 molecules of glucose joined together. So how you break up the glucose and the glucoamylase and the alpha amylase is critical to understanding your sugar profiles. And this is where running with visual knowledge on using a HPLC to look at your individual sugars, because effectively your residual sugars are maltose and glucose combined. Your residual starch is your maltotriose and your dextrins combined, but it doesn't give you insight to it throughout the fermentation. Proteases. If you look at the protein complex here, you can see it's binding around things. So proteases break the proteins from the corn down into amino acids and peptides and short amino acid chains. These provide a source of nitrogen, which is critical for the yeast. Typically speaking, when I'm managing struggling fermentations, if they're sluggish, the very first place I go is looking at nitrogen requirements and nitrogen supply. That usually cures about 70% of the current issues. If it's not a contamination, it's usually nitrogen, but there's other things. Breaking down this protein structure allows the amylases greater access to the starch. And by opening up the corn kernel matrix, these proteases can improve the release of corn oil, in some cases quite significantly. So, however, not all proteases are the same. So you need to find the right protease that's going to work on your right feedstock mixture. Sorry, excuse me. Fiber complexes, again, do a couple of things. By breaking down the fiber degrading enzymes can open up this corn matrix, again, greater access to starch, the proteins and the corn oils. So there's a common factor here that you're hearing me saying. It's about breaking up this matrix. Now, the one thing we're lucky about is that starch is designed by nature to be broken down into sugars. Nature designed starch. It's why starch is in seeds. It's why starch is in corn. When you plant a seed, it uses that starch until it gets its first green shoots. So nature designed starch to be broken down. The fiber and the cellulases and hemicellulase, or the cellulose and hemicellulose, is structural by design. So it's a lot harder to break down. It's very much more compact, but you can, utilizing the cellulase and hemicellulase, attack this fiber and make holes in it that open up areas. The other thing being is, certainly in the US, they are looking at fiber components of ethanol as one pathway to commonly use to lower the ethanol's carbon intensity. Now, this industry here, certainly on the fuel ethanol side, is not as mature as the North American one, but carbon intensity, sustainability is going to come here and fairly quickly. So these areas can have a significant impact. So we talk about distillers corn oil. Corn oil value has risen recently, certainly in the US. There's a variety of enzymatic options to increase the corn oil yield. Certainly, as I just said, the proteases and fiber-degrading enzymes can be used to open these up. But now many countries are starting to offer incentives to lower the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. This is the government's way of pushing people to be more sustainable. So conversion of fiber to ethanol using a fiber-degrading enzymes, corn kernel fiber, CKF pathway, or in situ cellulosic ethanol production provides a way to significantly lower the carbon intensity and increase the value of the ethanol sold. Basically, what they're doing is instead of trying to create a second generation plant on its own, they're taking what's left over after the first generation production, and then they're doing some pre-treatment and conversion post-distillation, and then feeding the resultant fermentation back. So it's being done in the US in, I think, 3 plants that I know of, but the profitability there doesn't come really from the ethanol. It comes from the government subsidy of the D4 RINs. So we talked about how we've done this. We've got glucoamylases doing singles, alpha amylases random, pullonases. This is effectively a debranching enzyme, and the fungal amylases or beta amylases can actually break down and produce maltose instead of glucose. So, as I said, alpha amylase does the following thing. It randomly breaks a long chain starch into molecules, short chains. As these chains are breaking, it also releases its water molecule, thus reducing the viscosity. So by breaking this chain, you actually create a molecule of water. So that viscosity is broken down. So when you're in your initial liquefaction tank, your main aim in that tank is to reduce viscosity to allow the ability to efficiently pump the mixture going through. But we haven't even made glucose yet. We talked about starch gelatinization. If you look here, you can see at 65, at 75, the molecules are swelling, and at 85, the starch molecules are breaking open. So different grains gelatinize at different temperatures, but they're fairly well documented, and they're available for depending what grain you're using. But effectively what happens is, as the temperature goes up, you get a massive increase in viscosity as these starch molecules swell. And then as they start to break open, you start to get the gelatinization temperature coming down. But then with the alpha amylase addition, you're reducing this a lot quicker. So a typical process is looking at a pre-cooked slurry tank. This is the American terminology. A slurry tank is effectively your ILT. A jet cooker, your liquefaction tank is the FLT, then you have a cooler, and it goes on to your fermentation. So typically a sacrificial amount of enzyme is put into the ILT to create the viscosity break, which is then damaged or denatured during the cook. The liquefaction tank is where the majority of the work is done. So typically speaking, 30-70 is the normal split. However, quite a lot of companies in the US, probably nearly everyone that I know, has taken out the jet cooker. They create some energy saving. Depending on your design, if you have a flash tank and you're recovering the heat energy from that flash tank, then there's only a small amount of energy saving. If you're actually venting that flash tank to this atmosphere, there is a significant energy saving. But what you're also doing is you're stopping this binding of the sugars and the proteins and Maillard reaction once you create basically protein, sugars, and heat. And you're also avoiding the loss of enzyme due to the deactivation of cook. So what does this mean? If you are tight on liquefaction time in your FLT, you can actually create a single liquefaction process by taking out the jet cooker and putting all your enzymes up front in the slurry tank. It also enables you to optimize your enzyme dose because you're no longer deactivating that 30%. However, what is not on this slide is there are some problems. You need to grind finer. And if you're grinding finer, you need to look at your centrifuges post-distillation because your thin slops that are coming back could contain higher unfermentable solids. So you have to manage everything. To be honest, I'm sorry to say this, but an ethanol plant is all about compromises. When you change something, it impacts something else. So it can be a negative or a positive impact. So you have to understand your whole process, and your technology provider or your advisors have to understand that they can't just look at fermentation, enzymes, milling in isolation. They have to understand the impacts to the whole process. The other thing it does is, taking out the jet cooker, is it impacts the residence time. So again, you can have a longer residence time and you can optimize your enzyme dosage. My preference, personally, I think with good documentation, monitoring, and analysis, taking out the jet cooker is, in my one, the way to go. However, in India, I think you need to look at it and understand better how you're processing. You need to understand, are your sugars still being released to there? Because there's no point in doing this if you lose 0.1 of a yield. You've got to keep the same recovery. You've got to keep the same process. There's ways, most of the jet cookers have a bypass. So there is ways of actually looking at this and taking it forward as a trial and saying, and doing comparative. But my own preference would be to have someone help you by having a way to analyze your sugars, your sugar profiles, and what's going into your fermenter. So what factors influence enzyme? Temperature. You need to look at it. High temperature can destabilize or denature the enzyme. Low temperature can cause slow enzyme activity. pH, generally speaking, the enzymes have a pH range that they are optimal at. They have a pH range that you can recover them from, and then they have a pH range that you will denature that enzyme. Other ions, some enzymes, calcium was a significant one 10, 15 years ago. Enzymes have advanced a lot since then, but you have to understand and make sure that your enzyme, if it has a need for a ion support, that it's there. High concentration of ethanol can destabilize some enzymes, but if you have a high concentration of ethanol, you've pretty much finished, so I wouldn't worry that much about that area. So what can you do? If the problem's caught in time and corrected, enzyme activity may be recovered. If the conditions are severe enough to denature the enzymes, the function may not be fully recovered. No, this is happening because both pH and temperature break ionic bonds, and the shape of the enzyme changes. So you go from the lock and key that works to the lock and key that doesn't work. Dosage. Adding additional enzyme can recover performance if you understand what's going on. But the aberrant condition must be corrected before adding that enzyme. If you've got high temperature, you have to bring the temperature down before you add more enzyme. If the pH is out of range, you have to bring the pH back before you add more enzyme. Residence time. For instance, if you have a pH that's slightly out, you may change the optimal process of the enzyme from 90% efficiency down to 70% efficiency. Having a longer residence time means that may not impact you as much as it would if you had a shorter residence time. So glucoamylase, it cleaves the glucose from the end of the starch chain. We've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to spend there. Best way to imagine it is a Pac-Man. Goes along the enzyme chain, just chewing off one, each one. Glucoamylases, they break the oligosaccharides, the dextrins, down to glucose. This process is known as saccharification. The GA consecutively hydrolyzes an alpha-1,4 glucosidic bonds from the non-reducing ends of dextrins resolved in the glucose. When you come to a branch, the enzyme doesn't work because the branch is an alpha-1,6 bond, and that enzyme is designed to break an alpha-1,4. So where you have a lot of branches, it then stops and it goes off and tries to find another end that it can chew down to. has a slight ability to do it if it's in the right position at the right time, but generally speaking, the pullonases or the debranching enzymes do a much better job. So let me just talk about the terminology that's certainly used in the US is DP1, DP2, DP3, DP4+. So if you look at these, so a glucose or dextrose unit is a DP1. DP2 is maltose, DP3 is maltotriose, and DP4, some people call it DP4, but the correct name is DP4+, is all the other dextrins unless it gets to a certain length, and then it's a polysaccharide. Your DP means the degree of polymerization. So let's come to a case study quickly. Your existing process, there are alpha amylases out there, and there are other alpha amylases out there. You need to understand how effective the enzyme you select. And this is why it's important to have a good relationship and understand which enzymes you're bringing. So this is actually a case study that we did in a live plant. So this is not lab data, this is actual plant data. The existing process had the dextrins, and it had about this was on a HPLC analysis, but it had 20.58 here, and then around here to the total. Looking at the liquefaction advance, we significantly reduced the what would be the RST, and we completely increased the RS unavailable. So this is giving you the yeast a lot more to work with. So what we had is in here, the specific gravity was 11.04 to 11.06 in the existing process. We came the same specific gravity, but the reducing sugar at the end of the titration changed completely differently. So advanced alpha amylase is effective in reducing the viscosity significantly on 100% maize. It's effective on higher solids because if you have a good viscosity break, you can put more solids in there and get the same efficient pumping. So your production throughout can be increased, so long as your fermentation can cope with the higher sugars and your fermentation time is enough to achieve complete fermentation. The residual starch here, this is post-fermentation. We went from a 1.41 down to 1.2, and we went from a 12.05 alcohol up to a 12.21. So a significant gain. The other thing that happens that by breaking down those sugars and allowing the yeast to ferment fully, you can actually get an improved DDGS and a more consistent color. So the DDGS, this is the starch in it. It went from 12.81 down to 9.83. So let's talk about delivery of enzymes. And I'm not going to talk about totes and measuring it. There's ways to do that. And if you're using any enzyme, your enzyme supplier should be able to tell you how to check the dosage and everything else. But typically these enzymes are provided as an externally added product termed exogenous. Recently, genetically modified yeast have been developed that can express their own enzymes or multiple enzymes. One variant of this is able to express as a required glucoamylase. So this type of yeast is in commercial use in multiple countries, and it is already currently going through regulatory approval process in India. We have already submitted 8 end user applications, and we're waiting for final approval. We have submitted an importation, and we've had verbal approval, but we have to do one more round of documentation, and we're expecting approval to be able to release this yeast into the industry within 3 months? Hopefully 3 months. What does it do? The advanced yeast will express both glucoamylase and trihalase. So it enables a reduction of the purchased enzymes, enzyme costs, there's an exact cost saving, plus it gives a bit of yield improvement. Now, what does that mean for you guys? It means that in India, although you don't have HPLCs, you can't, and I will tell you, by the way, the GM yeast used in the US are like 3 or 4 generations beyond the one that we're putting in here. The reason we chose the one in here is that you can measure the benefit completely because it actually replaces 100% of the GA that you need for fermentation. So you can actually literally count the jerry cans that you're not using as your cost benefit. So the other thing that happens is in a typical process, you can get up to 6, 8, or 10% glucose concentration at the start of fermentation. By going with this yeast producing it, it regulates its own GA that's required, and it lowers the amount of glucose, thus lowering the stress on the yeast. And so what we found in every case, and this actually was a trial that was done in Thailand, and they did over 150 fermenters. So it was an extensive trial, and in every case, we saw a gain in alcohol over the control. And that's also, that was on cassava, which actually has a relatively high lactic acid content within the cassava. So this handles lactic acids very well, and it handles stress and temperature. So what can I say to you? You need to understand the conditions that you have and the conditions you can control. That enables you to make your enzymes as efficient as you can. If you can't control to those processes, you need to understand what you need to build into your process to offset that lack of control. Controlling the parameters tightly maximizes the performance of your process, and different enzymes have different optimal parameters. So choosing the best enzyme to match your process will maximize your energy and efficiency and performance. And lastly, adopting new technologies will improve your profitability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes for any questions from the audience. The floor is open. Yes, can we pass the mic right at the back? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I am Harishankar Shukla, Executive Vice President from Ethanol, Unit Sitapur. My question is, you have shown that this advance and by this advanced name, the sugar in liquefaction will be 2 to 3%. In the present practice, we are having the 5 to 5.5%. So I want to know from you that whether lowering the sugar in the liquefaction will be beneficial to the process.
Yeah, the way it hydrolyzes is very different. That's why you see lesser amount of glucose and maltose. But what happens is that in the DP4 plus, you are getting much higher, basically around 25%. So the higher chain dextrins are in the range of like DP7 to DP9. So basically it's much more easier for the yeast to break it down, releasing these sugars, as Chris mentioned in his presentation as a Pac-Man enzyme. So it will have a definite advantage going forward.
That's okay. So then in the fermentation, whether it will be able to convert full starch into sugar and get in the alcohol?
Can you please repeat?
If you are maintaining such low sugar in the liquefaction, so while going to the fermenter, in the parallel reaction with the saccharification as well as the fermentation, so there it will be able to provide the sufficient sugar to the yeast?
Exactly. It will have the sufficient sugar to the yeast. And it will make the life easier, the glucoamylase. It just needs to work on the shorter chain dextrins.
So have you made any trials in our Indian industry?
This is commercially running in few plants in India. We can take it up offline, sir, when we catch up.
Okay, I would like to have references.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Prakash from Radico. I have two questions. Probably.
Sir, may I request you to be slightly louder? Thank you.
Yeah, this is Prakash from Radico. I have two queries, probably to you as well as the earlier speaker of Novonesis also. You are mentioning about the bound starch, which normally need to get released where you use the advanced enzyme which will get released. So what is the study or what is the methodology which you have adopted or industry in USA or here adopting to analyze that? Because it's again What we are seeing is only through documentation or through theories or through some trials. Some people have a benefit, some people doesn't have a benefit. So how it can be analyzed, how it can be really seen by the end user. That is one. My second query is about the jet cooker. So both the people told jet cooker can be avoided. This is still a debate. So you should have presented some data. So with jet cooker, without jet cooker, these are the advantages, either on the protein or residual starches and all. If you have data, can you share with us? So this all goes as evident and easy for the industry to understand and take it forward. Up to you.
Okay, in respect to the jet cooker or no jet cooker, offline, if you want to speak with Rajesh, he can certainly provide you data that we've done, certainly in the US, and I believe that we ran a few trials a number of years back in India on broken rice. Talking about your first question was the starch, bound starch. There's effectively three ways of breaking up that bound starch. The first is temperature, and this is what the jet cooker does. It takes it up and it also depends on your pre-liquefaction temperature, because probably the most effective way is to actually do no liquefaction in the initial liquefaction temperature, initial liquefaction tank, and go at a non-gelatinized temperature, and they go a lower temperature, and then go through a very high jet cook around about 135 C, 125 C, and explode the molecule. This is pretty much what the company in Scotland I was talking about does with the whole grain. But you're looking to basically pop the grain up, and that will open up the grain significantly. The second one is a physical breakdown of grain, and this is where the US are going forward with their fine grind selective milling process. Basically, they go through the hammer mill, and then they go through a secondary mill, and it can either be a wet mill or an inline homogenizer to break down to a very uniform starch particle. And that physical separation grinds up the matrix, and it goes to a very, very fine grind. But as I said, you need an extremely well-balanced plant and a very high-performing centrifuge at the end to make sure you're not bringing very fine particles back in your backset or thin slops or the recycle. The third way is to then look at enzymology. So that is to break down these structures using enzymes during liquefaction and during fermentation. So you're looking at proteases, hemicellulases, cellulases. These can attack the structure. On the distilled spirits side, they tend to do the protein stand at the very up front. So you do a lower temperature stand to break down protein, then they do a liquefaction effect, and then they go down to the fermented. But that is for very specific reasons on sort of whiskey flavors and whiskey performance. But the protein stand, that you've got to understand, enzymes work at different efficiencies. Go back 15, 20 years, most plants had a saccharification tank because they knew that the glucoamylase was more effective at 50 degrees than it is at fermentation temperature of 35, so they could use less glucoamylase in the saccharification tank. What it created was a dramatic contamination zone because bacteria can grow at those temperatures, sugars were being performed, yeast couldn't grow, so you had a great contamination zone. So now I'm not aware of a single plant in the US that uses saccharification tank. I'm not sure of many plants in India that use them. Plants in China are still using them. But then again, Chinese antibiotics are free or very cheap. But this is how an industry develops. They have a process, they look at it, and then they evaluate the benefits of change to that process. So you should deal with the jet cooker exactly the way they dealt with the saccharification tank. Look at it and find a way to measure and test the performance of the grain or the liquefaction system with and without that system and make sure that it doesn't impact your yield and it doesn't impact your solids level coming back with unfermentable solids. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Chris, thanks for the detailed explanation. My query was slightly different. Fine. I was asking about how you analyze the bound starch. What is the systems available, either in US or in India? Because see, it's again cannot be done only in R&D centers, day in, day out, during operation, to evaluate and get the better out of them. What are the systems available to find the bound starch?
The problem you've got is trying to do it inline, online, or in real time is very, very difficult because the test takes quite a while. And by the time you tested it, your probably process has already gone forward. But if you want to look at your process there for bound starch and improvements in breaking bound starch down, I would look at your starch content of your DDGs. So work out the time lag between treatment in the liquefaction tank and the DDGs being produced and look at your starch content in the DDGs. The only downside of that is starch evaluation can be, in wet chemistry, can be quite variable in results. This is where probably the NIR would actually come into its own and looking at the starch content of the DDGs. But that's, from a plant point of view, that's probably the easiest way. You can, of course, always take a liquefied sample straight from the end of liquefaction, put it through a dryer or an oven dry it, and then look at the starch, analyze that using acid hydrolysis to break down everything and look at your starch content there. That's the two ways I would do it. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, any more questions? Okay, we have, this would be the last one. We only have 2 minutes. So can we quickly ask the question? Over there, behind.
Myself is Mohan Sharma, NSL Sugars. What should be temperature in liquefaction ideal? And what should be retention time in liquefaction, as you say?
I like a minimum, personally I like a minimum of about 3 hours total. The reason for that, you probably need about 90 minutes to 2 hours. But with in India, with the fluctuations in the process and fluctuations in the quality of the feedstock, and that sometimes where plants change from different feedstocks, I would like to look at your residence time around about 3 hours. Bearing in mind, if your process doesn't need 3 hours and you want less, you can lower your tank levels and you can trim your residence time to what you want. What you can't do is create residence time. So if I was designing a plant, I would design it with a 3-hour residence time, and then I would set my tank levels to achieve the residence time that I want for that process.
Thank you so much. With this, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude our second session for today. Thank you so much, Mr. Richards, Mr. Mohan, and Mr. Junjunwala, for sharing your thoughts, ideas, and experience with us. Can we please have a huge round of applause for our wonderful speakers of the second session? I request you all to please have a seat. We can quickly have a photograph of all three of you. Thank you so much. Thank you.